I want you to understand something before I tell you this story. I want you to understand what the word unclaimable actually means, because I didn't understand it at the time. I thought I did. I nodded along in the briefings like every other human liaison officer who got assigned to Nocturna Station. I read the Galactic Codex entries. I passed the interspecies sensitivity training with a 92% score. And I still didn't know. Unclaimable. In the vampire registry, the one maintained by the Nocturna High Council, the one that goes back 11,000 years, the one that has never once been challenged by any species in the galaxy, that word means exactly what it sounds like. It means no one will take her. It means she has been offered to every eligible bloodline in the known galaxy, and every single one of them looked away. It means she has been standing in that offering chamber for so long that the High Council stopped bothering to schedule new claim sessions. It means something is wrong with her. That's what they told me, the morning before everything changed. That's what Commander Vranic told me, very calmly, over a cup of something that smelled like burnt copper and tasted like nothing at all. He said, "She's been unclaimable for 240 years, Vane. Don't look at her directly. Don't speak to her unless spoken to. And whatever you do, do not raise your hand in that chamber." I said I understood. I didn't. Nocturna Station sits at the edge of what the galactic maps call the Velera Rift, a strip of space that the human navigators nicknamed the Bruise because of how it looks from the observation deck. Deep purple, shot through with veins of dark red light, like something massive was injured there a long time ago and never quite healed. The rift doesn't do anything. It doesn't affect navigation, doesn't emit unusual radiation, doesn't pull ships off course. It just sits there and looks wrong. Most species don't like posting near the Bruise. Humans got stationed there because we were the only ones who thought it was beautiful. I remember arriving on Nocturna Station for the first time. This was about 14 months before the incident, and stepping off the transport shuttle into the docking bay and just stopping. Every other first-timer I've ever talked to says the same thing. You stop. You stand there in the middle of the docking bay with your kit bag sliding off your shoulder and you just look around. Nocturna Station is old. Not old like the ruins they dig up on colony worlds, not old like a museum piece. Old like a living thing that has simply refused to die. The walls are made from something the architects call veldstone, a black volcanic composite that the Nocturna builders quarried from a moon that no longer exists. It absorbs light. Every corridor on the station is lit by thin strips of bioluminescent tubing that runs along the floor instead of the ceiling. So the light comes from below, which means every shadow falls upward. You're always walking through rooms where the dark is above you and the glow is at your feet. It takes about 3 weeks to stop feeling like you're walking on the surface of something alive. I stopped feeling it after 4 weeks, which my colleague Dina Marsh said meant I had slower adaptation reflexes than average. She was probably right. She was usually right about those things. Dina was my bunkmate and my first genuine friend on the station. She'd been there for 2 years before I arrived, long enough that she moved through the corridors with a loose, easy confidence that I envied deeply for the first several months. She was the one who explained the vampire social hierarchy to me in plain language, without all the diplomatic softening that the official briefings used. "The bloodlines are everything," she told me the second night I was there. We were in the mess hall, the human section, which had normal ceiling lighting and chairs that were built for human-shaped bodies. And she was eating something that looked like a grain bowl while I was still figuring out what half the food options were. Not like family is everything back home, like there is nothing else. A vampire without a bloodline affiliation is like, okay, imagine if you removed someone's name, not just their ID number, their actual name, their ability to be recognized as a person. That's what it's like. I said that sounded extreme. She said, "You'll see." She was right about that too. The station housed about 400 vampires on any given cycle, plus approximately 260 other species, humans being the second largest group at around 80, with the rest spread across a dozen others. The Dreth, the Sorvani, the Kelhari, the Meyervans, most of them were there for trade negotiation or diplomatic posting. The vampires were there because Nocturna Station was theirs. It had been built by their ancestors, maintained by their bloodlines, and operated under High Council jurisdiction. Every other species on the station was technically a guest. The vampires didn't exactly let you forget that. Not in an aggressive way, most of the time. It was quieter than that. It was the way they moved through corridors like they owned every centimeter of floor. It was the way they regarded you with those pale, colorless eyes, not hostile, just utterly, completely unimpressed. It was the way the station itself seemed designed for them, every surface and angle and temperature calibrated to a species that ran cold and saw better in darkness. The first vampire I ever really talked to beyond formal greeting protocol was a mid-tier bloodline attaché named Sorrel. He was assigned as my initial station orientation guide, which meant he spent approximately 45 minutes walking me through the critical sections of the station at a pace that was clearly designed for someone with much longer legs and much less interest in stopping to look at things. He had the angular, slightly unsettling features that most of the vampires shared: sharp jaw, high cheekbones, a stillness to the face that was less like calm and more like the complete absence of the micro-expressions that humans make constantly without realizing it. No eyebrow twitch, no lip compression, no slight widening of the eyes when something was interesting. Just a face that was set like old stone. But he was perfectly polite, answered every question I asked, which were a lot, and only let his mild impatience show once, when I stopped in the middle of the secondary corridor to read a carved inscription on the wall. "What does this say?" I asked. He glanced at it without stopping. Valera script. It translates roughly to, "The dark does not threaten, the dark is simply home." I stood there a moment longer, looking at it. "That's actually kind of beautiful," I said. He looked at me then. For just a second, something moved behind those pale eyes, not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it. Then it was gone. "Come," he said, "we have 6 more sections." I followed him, but I kept thinking about that inscription. The dark does not threaten, the dark is simply home. Because here's the thing, that was the first time I started to understand that maybe the briefings had it slightly wrong. Maybe the vampires weren't simply cold. Maybe they were just home in a way that most other species weren't, and everything that looked like coldness from the outside was actually just the self-possession of a creature that had never once doubted where it belonged. I was thinking about that, actually. I was thinking about belonging on the morning that Commander Vranic called me into his office and told me about the claim session. It was the 312th day of my posting. I know the number because I was keeping a log. I'd started keeping it about a month in, partly to manage the isolation of being so far from any human majority system, partly because I was genuinely finding the interspecies dynamics fascinating enough that I wanted to document them. My log was not a formal document. It was more like talking to myself in text form, which I realize is a slightly concerning thing to admit in what is supposed to be an official witness statement, but I was told to be thorough, so. Vranic called me in at the beginning of the station's artificial morning cycle. The station runs on a 27-hour day to compromise between multiple species' biological rhythms, which means that morning is a somewhat negotiable concept. But the lights in the administrative section do a slow brightening thing that signals the start of the primary shift, and that's when Vranic typically summoned people. He was not a large man. I always want to clarify that when I describe Vranic, because his authority filled space in a way that made people misremember him as physically imposing when he wasn't. He was average height, slight build, pale brown skin, a careful way of moving that suggested he thought about every motion before he made it. He'd been posted to Nocturna Station for 9 years, which was the longest any human had served there, and it showed in the way he'd absorbed something of the vampire stillness, not imitating it exactly, but adapting to it, the way a plant adapts its growth to the light available. He told me to sit. I sat. He told me that there was a High Council claim session scheduled for the following station morning. He explained, and here is where I started to feel the first small thread of unease, the kind you feel before you consciously know why, that this particular session was unusual. That it had been called not because a new claimant had come forward, but because the council had decided to perform what they called a final review of a particularly long-standing unclaimed case. I asked what that meant. He took a slow drink of that burnt copper-smelling liquid he always had and said, "It means they're going to make a decision about what to do with her." Heard. The High Council manages unclaimed vampires, he continued, in a tiered system. The longer someone remains unclaimed, the more restricted their freedoms become. Not as punishment, at least not technically. more as a function of how bloodline society operates. An unclaimed vampire has no bloodline anchor, no social position, no recognized standing. The station isn't quite sure how to categorize them, which creates logistical complications. I asked how long the person in question had been unclaimed. He told me 240 years. The number sat in the room between us for a moment. That's how I started. Yes, he said. How old is she? By vampire reckoning, relatively young, perhaps 320 years. She came into her full maturation at around 80. That's when vampires traditionally enter the bloodline claim process, and she has never been successfully claimed. He set down his cup. There have been 17 formal claim attempts, all withdrawn. Why? He paused. Vranic didn't pause often. It meant something when he did. She's difficult, he said finally. Volatile, the word the vampires use in their own tongue is varsedhi. It translates roughly to unbound fire. She doesn't comply with bloodline protocol. She doesn't defer to higher bloodlines. She doesn't moderate her behavior. She is, by vampire social standards, completely and utterly feral. I thought about this. Is she dangerous? She has never killed anyone on the station. She has broken 3 separate diplomats' orbital bones, all during formal claim sessions. He looked at me steadily. She broke them deliberately, vain, not as violence for its own sake, as a message. What message? No. I sat with that for a moment. So what happens at a final review? I asked. Vranic was quiet again. Then, the council has a few options. They can designate her as bloodline independent, which is essentially a formal acknowledgement of permanent unclaimed status, with significant social and logistical restrictions. They can reclassify her entirely. There are categories in the old registry for vampires who don't fit the standard social structure. Or, he stopped. Or what? Or they open the session to non-vampire claimants, which they have never done in 11,000 years of records. The thread of unease became something more specific. Why are you telling me this? I asked. He looked at me for a long moment. Then, because the council sent a formal advisory this morning, they've decided to open it. Silence. To all registered species on the station, he continued, which includes us. More silence. I need liaison officers present in the chamber as observers, he said. Formal requirement, but I need you specifically to understand what you are walking into. This session is going to be tense. The vampire factions on the station are not unified on this decision. Half of them see it as a necessary pragmatic measure. The other half see it as a profound insult to their traditions. Either way, there will be watching, and there will be judgment. He met my eyes. You are there as an observer. You observe. You do not speak. You do not react. And you absolutely, under no circumstances, raise your hand. Raise my hand, I repeated. The claim session has a formal protocol. The presiding elder states the unclaimed's name and asks if any present wish to enter a claim. Eligible parties raise their hand. It sounds archaic because it's one of the oldest rituals in vampire culture. His voice was level and very deliberate. You are not eligible. No human has ever been eligible. Do not raise your hand. Obviously, I said. He looked at me. Obviously, I said again, less certainly. He nodded once and dismissed me. I told Dina about it that evening, over food in the mess hall. She put her fork down about halfway through my summary and stared at me. She's been unclaimable for 240 years, she said. Yeah. And they're opening it to other species. Yeah. Marcus, she picked her fork back up, pointed it at me in a way that was meant to be emphasizing but mostly just looked like she was threatening me with a utensil. You are going in there as an observer. Say it back to me. I'm going in as an observer, I said. Say I will not raise my hand. Dina, say it. I will not raise my hand, I said, obviously. She nodded slowly and went back to eating. Then, after a moment, what's her name? I realized I didn't know. Vranic hadn't told me and I hadn't thought to ask. I don't know, I said. Dina chewed thoughtfully. Find out before you go in there, she said. It matters. To vampires, names are it matters. I nodded. I did not ask why she was telling me that specifically. I should have asked why she was telling me that specifically. Looking back, I think she knew something I didn't. Or maybe she just knew me better than I knew myself, which at the time felt like the same thing. I found out her name the next morning from Sorrel. I caught him in the secondary corridor on his way to the administrative section and asked him, somewhat awkwardly, because we had a professional but not exactly warm relationship, if he could tell me the name of the vampire whose claim session was scheduled that day. He stopped walking. The stillness on his face got even more still, which I hadn't known was possible. "Why do you want to know?" he asked. "I'm attending as a liaison observer," I said. "I want to be properly prepared." He looked at me for a moment that stretched just slightly past comfortable. Then he said, "Zara Vel Nocturne." I said the name over in my head a few times, making sure I had it. Zara Vel Nocturne. The middle part, Vel, I knew from the codex. It was a transitional marker. It went between a vampire's given name and their bloodline designation. Vel specifically indicated a bloodline in suspension, neither claimed nor formally released, which meant her name itself was a record of what had been done to her and what hadn't. "Thank you," I said. He nodded, then just as I was turning to go, "Vain." I turned back. His face was still that careful stone, but something in his voice was different, not warm, just different. "She is not what you are going to expect," he said. I didn't know what to do with that, so I said, "Okay." "I mean that specifically," he said. "Every account you have heard of her, every description, those are things witnessed by people who were afraid of her. What you see through fear is not what is there." He paused. "I am not saying this as a warning. I am saying this as information." I didn't know what to do with that either. "I appreciate it," I said, because it was the most truthful thing I could say. He nodded again and continued down the corridor. I stood there for a moment, alone in the upward falling light. "She is not what you are going to expect." Then I went to get ready for the session. The claim chamber is in the deepest section of the station. Not underground, obviously, because there's no ground, just layers of station hull, but the lowest habitable level, which the builders had set apart from the rest of the station's functions as a dedicated ceremonial space. You reach it through a transit corridor that's wider than the standard passageways and lined entirely in veldstone without the bioluminescent strips. The light in there comes from somewhere else, some kind of diffused atmospheric system that makes the air itself glow, faintly, at a frequency that sits just at the edge of human visibility. Walking into that corridor, I felt the temperature drop. Not dramatically, maybe 3 degrees in standard measure, but enough to notice. Enough that the back of my neck responded before the rest of me caught up. The other liaison observers were already there when I arrived, Petra Solon from the Kelhari diplomatic team, and a Sorven attaché named Vesh, whose species I kept mixing up with the Meyervans until Dina drew me a chart. We nodded at each other with the tight, controlled acknowledgement of people who are trying very hard to appear more composed than they feel. The chamber itself. Look, I've tried to describe this chamber in my log 3 different ways, and none of them quite land. So I'm going to try again here with the understanding that there is something about the space that language does a partial job of conveying. It was a circle, high-ceilinged. I'd estimate 20 meters from floor to dome, and perfectly circular, maybe 30 meters across. The walls were carved veldstone in deeply cut geometric patterns that I would learn later were 11,000-year-old bloodline records. Every vampire clan that had ever operated out of Nocturna Station had its lineage carved into these walls. The floor was a single continuous piece of dark glass, not reflective, just dark, like looking down into depth you can't quite measure. There was a dais at the center, raised about a foot off the floor, and on the dais was a single chair that was, I want to say, throne, but it wasn't decorative enough for that. It was a claiming chair. That's the actual term. It was built for someone to sit in and be seen, and what it communicated was power, not ornamentation. The High Council members were already seated when we entered, 7 of them, arranged in a formal arc at one end of the chamber. They were the oldest vampires on the station, which meant they moved differently from the others. Not slower exactly, more deliberate, like each motion was made with the full awareness of how many years had learned it. The presiding elder was a vampire named Counselor Dreven, who I knew by sight and by reputation. 600 years old, minimum. Possibly older, vampire age becomes difficult to estimate past a certain point because the aging process essentially halts. He was the kind of old that had stopped looking like anything and started looking like itself. There were about 40 other vampires in the chamber, arranged in loose faction groupings around the edges. I recognized some of them, bloodline heads, senior attachés, a few diplomatic representatives. They were all watching the dais. The chair on the dais was empty. We were placed, us observer liaisons, in a designated section to the left, clearly visible but clearly demarcated. Not part of the session. Witnesses. I stood with my hands at my sides and looked at the empty chair and tried to remember the breathing exercise that the orientation materials recommended for high-stress interspecies situations, which I had never actually practiced. The chamber was quiet. Not silent, there was a very low vibration in the air, almost below hearing, that I realized after a few moments was the station itself. The hum of the systems, the breath of the life support. Every station has it, this baseline hum, but in the claimed chamber it was more present than anywhere else on Nocturna, like the room was specifically designed to make you hear it. Counselor Dreven rose. The room got quieter. He said something in Valera, the old vampire tongue, that I didn't fully catch, but I recognized the ceremonial cadence of it. Opening ritual, acknowledgement of the bloodline records on the walls, formal statement of purpose. Then, in galactic standard, the council convenes in final review of the case of Zara Vel Nocturne, unclaimed, standing, 243 years of active registry. All formal bloodline claim processes are concluded. Today the council exercises its authority under the ancient codes to seek final resolution. He paused. "Bring her in," he said. And that was the moment everything changed. I want to try to describe what it was like when she entered the chamber. I've thought about this a lot, not just in the immediate aftermath, but in the months since, turning it over and looking at it from different angles, trying to figure out exactly what happened physiologically and psychologically in that first moment. Here's what I've settled on. Most people, when they enter a room, make a kind of claim on it, not consciously, not aggressively. They just arrive and the room adjusts around them. Some people make a larger claim than others. Some people enter a room and barely register. It's a spectrum. Zara Vel Nocturne didn't enter the room. The room rearranged itself around her arrival. She came through the side entrance, not the main ceremonial doors, but a smaller door set into the carved wall. And for a second I didn't realize who I was looking at because she wasn't moving in the way I expected. She wasn't restrained. She wasn't escorted in the manner that the briefing notes had suggested. 2 council guards, standard protocol for volatile unclaimed individuals. There were guards, yes, but they were walking behind her, not flanking her, and there was about a meter of space between them that looked less like tactical positioning and more like a choice. Like they'd learned to keep distance. She was taller than I'd imagined. That was the first clear thought I had. Taller and built differently from most of the vampires on the station who tended toward a lean, almost architectural quality, structured and geometric. She was, I'm going to say, fluid, not soft. There was nothing soft about the way she moved. But where most vampires had that carved stillness, she had motion, even standing still. Like there was something running through her that wouldn't stop, that couldn't be made to stop, that had been asked to stop many times and had declined each time. Her hair was dark, very dark, the kind of black that catches whatever light is around it and gives nothing back, and it was loose, which I would learn later was a significant detail. In vampire culture, unbound hair on a female vampire in formal settings is considered a statement. It's the kind of statement that requires context and history to fully understand, but the short version is, it means I refuse the presentation. I am not here to be assessed. I am here because you summoned me, and I came, but I am not going to perform for you. She walked to the dais. She sat in the claiming chair. And then she looked at the room. I say she looked at the room. What I mean is that her gaze moved through the assembled vampires with a quality that I can only describe as surgical. She was assessing. Not nervously, not defensively, with the calm, almost bored precision of someone who has seen this room and these faces many times before and has long since stopped finding any of it surprising. Her eyes were not the pale, colorless eyes that most vampires had. That was the first thing that registered as wrong, wrong in the sense of different from expectation, not wrong in any negative sense. They were dark. Very dark, nearly black, but with something in them that wasn't quite any color I could name, a depth that seemed to go inward further than an eye should reasonably go. It might have been a trick of the chamber's light. I'm not sure it was. She swept the room, and then she swept to the observer section. And then she found me. I don't know how long we looked at each other. It wasn't long, objectively. Maybe 4 seconds, maybe 3. But I want to be precise in this account, because I'm trying to be honest about what happened and how, and so I need to say, in those 3 or 4 seconds, I had the very clear, very rational, very completely inexplicable sensation that she was reading something. Not my mind. I'm not assigning anything mystical to this. More like the way you might read a face for the information it contains without consciously intending to. And what she was reading in me, whatever it was, clearly landed differently than expected, because something crossed her face. Not expression exactly, more like the ghost of one. A slight, almost fractional shift at the corner of her mouth. Then she looked away, back to the council. I realized I had stopped breathing at some point, and quietly started again. On my left, Petra Solon leaned very slightly in my direction and murmured, nearly inaudible, "She looked at you." "I noticed," I murmured back. "They're not supposed to look at the observer section." "I know." Silence for a moment. "She looked at you specifically," Petra added. "Petra," I murmured, "I know." Counselor Dreven began the formal process. He outlined the case in Velara first, then in galactic standard for the benefit of the non-vampire species present, which was, the phrasing of it implied, a significant concession to practicality rather than courtesy. He ran through the claim history, 17 formal claim attempts, the names of the bloodlines that had attempted them, and the official reasons recorded for each withdrawal. I found the official reasons interesting. That was the first one. 3 more broke orbital bones before it was over, different observers, different sessions. Bloodline Caldera, candidate deemed unmanageable. And so it went, through 17 bloodlines, each entry more carefully diplomatic in its language, but all pointing to the same underlying fact. She wouldn't be managed, she wouldn't be contained, she wouldn't perform the expected deference, she wouldn't become what claiming was supposed to make her. She sat through Dreven's recitation with her hands loose in her lap, and her face perfectly composed, and her dark eyes fixed on a point somewhere just above the council arc that suggested she was either very focused or very far away. When Dreven finished, he addressed her directly. "Zaravel Nocturne," he said. "You have heard the record stated. Do you dispute any point in the formal account?" Silence. Then she said, "No." Her voice was, I'm going to try to describe this carefully because the voice is important. It was low, lower than I'd expected from looking at her. Not performed low, not the kind of voice someone makes deliberately to project authority. Just low the way the station's hum was low, like it was coming from somewhere deeper than the surface. And it was very even. Not flat, there was something in it, some quality of restrained motion, like the voice itself was keeping something in check. "No," she said. "The record is accurate." "Very well." Dreven settled his robes, an old-fashioned gesture, something very human about it. Actually, the way formal robes get settled before important pronouncements. "The Council has determined, in accordance with the ancient codes, to open today's session to all registered species on this station. This is acknowledged as an unprecedented measure. It is undertaken in recognition of the extraordinary length of this case and the absence of any viable resolution within standard bloodline parameters." The room shifted, not physically, but the quality of the air changed. Several of the faction vampires on the far side of the chamber made very small motions that communicated, even to my relatively inexperienced reading of vampire body language, significant disapproval. Zaravel Nocturne's hands in her lap went very still. "The session is hereby formally opened," Dreven said. "Any eligible party present may register a claim on the unclaimed Zaravel Nocturne. The period for claims will be—" "I have a question." The voice that interrupted Dreven was not mine. It came from the Sorvan attaché, Vesh, who was standing 2 positions down from me in the observer section, and who had apparently decided that sitting quietly as an observer was a recommendation rather than a requirement. The entire chamber turned to look at the observer section. Dreven's expression did not change, but something in the quality of his stillness suggested that he was working to maintain it. "This is an observer position," he said carefully. "Observers do not have floor access during." "The session is open to all registered species," Vesh said. His translator unit was giving his voice a flat, slightly mechanical quality, but the confidence underneath came through clearly enough. I would like to understand the definition of claim before the period opens, for the sake of cultural accuracy. A pause. A claim, Dreven said, with the deliberate patience of someone who very much wanted to say something other than what they were saying, is a formal declaration of intent to integrate an unclaimed individual into a registered bloodline or species household. It establishes legal connection, social standing, and mutual obligation under galactic code. Mutual, Vesh pressed. The codes do require acknowledgement from the claimed party, Dreven said. Historically, refusal renders the claim void. Historically, Vesh echoed. Then he nodded and said nothing more. The silence in the chamber was very pointed. Dreven refocused. As stated, the claim period is now open. Any eligible party who wishes to enter a claim, please. He said, raise your hand. That's when it happened. Let me be very clear about the sequence of events, because I've been asked about it multiple times, and I want the record to reflect exactly what occurred. Dreven said, raise your hand. There was a pause of approximately, I don't know exactly, 3 seconds, maybe 4, long enough that the silence itself became an event. Long enough that several of the faction vampires on the far side of the chamber began to exchange glances that communicated satisfaction. The satisfaction of people who had known all along that this would end in nothing, that no one would raise a hand, that the session would close without a claim, and the council would proceed to their fallback resolutions. Long enough that I felt the full weight of the moment pressing against me from all directions. I was not thinking rationally. I want to say this clearly. I was not engaging in a reasoned assessment of consequences. I was not executing a plan. I was not operating on the basis of any guidance, protocol, instruction, or prior intention. I was looking at Zara Vel Nocturne. I was looking at her, and she was looking at the floor. For the first time since she'd entered the chamber, she had dropped her gaze from that fixed point above the council arc, and she was looking at the dark glass floor, and her hands in her lap were not loose anymore. They were folded together with a tension in the knuckles that spoke of something being held in. I was looking at her, and I was thinking about Sorrel saying she is not what you are going to expect. I was thinking about Vranik saying do not raise your hand. I was thinking about 17 bloodlines and 240 years, and broken orbital bones that all said the same word. No, 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 no. Said the same word to the same kind of question. And I was thinking that maybe the question had been wrong every single time. My hand went up. I want to be accurate. It went up. I was not unaware of what I was doing, but the motion had a quality of inevitability to it, like a door opening because something was leaning against it from the other side, like a natural consequence of a long accumulation of pressure that I hadn't fully recognized until the moment of release. My right hand raised to approximately shoulder height, clear, unambiguous. The chamber erupted. Not in sound. Vampires don't erupt in sound the way humans do. It erupted in motion. 40 vampires who had been standing with carefully controlled stillness suddenly had none of it. They moved, turned, oriented, every body in the room redirecting toward the observer section with a speed that the human nervous system registers as threat before the rational mind catches up. Petra Solon said something very quietly that I won't repeat here. Vesh made a sound that his translator unit declined to convert. Dreven, Counselor Dreven, 600-year-old presiding elder of the High Council, looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as, I have existed for 6 centuries, and nothing has prepared me for this exact moment. And then there was silence. Into that silence, I said, because I'd been taught that in interspecies formal settings, an action without verbal accompaniment is considered incomplete, I said, I wish to enter a claim. The silence went even more silent, which logically shouldn't be possible and yet somehow was. And then, from the dais, from the claiming chair, from the person who had not moved a single centimeter during any of this, Zara Vel Nocturne looked up. She looked directly at me, not the chamber, not the council, not the faction vampires who were radiating barely contained outrage in my general direction. She looked at me. And the thing I saw on her face in that moment. I've tried to write this several times and kept abandoning it because it sounds melodramatic when written out. But this is a formal account, and I promise to be accurate, so What I saw on her face was surprise. Genuine, unguarded, completely uncontrolled surprise. Which might not sound significant unless you understand that she had been sitting in this chamber, in various iterations of this ceremony, for 240 years. Unless you understand that in that time she had developed, out of sheer necessity, an absolute mastery of her own presentation. Unless you understand that the people who had tried to claim her before had been doing it out of social obligation or political calculation or bloodline strategy. Not one of them, apparently, had surprised her. I had surprised her. Driven recovered first, whatever that means for a 600-year-old vampire, but he did settle back into the formal frame faster than anyone else in the room. He stopped. A claim has been entered. He seemed to be choosing each word with extreme care. By another pause, the human liaison officer, Marcus Elliot Vane, of Earth designation, currently posted. I know who he is, Zara said. The room went still again. Her voice was different, still low, still that quality of restrained motion, but something else in it now. Something I couldn't name exactly, except that it wasn't the same complete flatness it had been during the formal recitation. You know, Driven began. I know who he is, she repeated. She was still looking at me. He's been on this station for 312 days. He keeps a log. He reads wall inscriptions in corridors and stops to think about them. He asked Sorrel my name this morning. A pause. He's the only person in this room who asked for my name. The silence in the chamber shifted into a different register entirely. Driven looked at me with an expression that was now somewhat less I have no context for this, and somewhat more I am beginning to understand something I don't know how to formally address. The codes require, he said carefully, that a claim be formally acknowledged or rejected by the claimed party. He looked at Zara. Zara Vel Nocturne, a claim has been entered on your behalf by, he seemed to struggle again, a registered non-vampire party. Do you acknowledge or reject? The chamber held its breath. She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she said, what does your claim mean, human? She was asking me, not the council. She was asking me directly in front of everyone, and the question had a quality to it that made clear she was not asking for my credentials or my species profile or my bloodline equivalent. She was asking what I meant by it. I said, it means I see you. The room was so quiet I could hear the station hum. Just that, she said. To start with, I said, yeah. Another pause, longer this time. Driven looked like he was watching a procedure he had no protocol for. Zara Vel Nocturne, who had broken 17 people's bones in this room, who had said no in every language available to her for 240 years, who had sat in this claiming chair enough times to have worn something of herself into the dark glass floor beneath it. Took a very slow, very deliberate breath. I don't break orbital bones, she said, for fun. I know, I said. You break them because the question has always been wrong. Something moved across her face that I didn't have a name for yet. And yours isn't, she said. Mine might be just as wrong, I said. I'm not claiming to know better than anyone in this room. I'm just the only one in this room who thought the right answer to everything you've been saying for 240 years might be, okay. The chamber was completely still. Then, okay, she repeated. Okay, I said. You said no 17 times to 17 different approaches to the same question, okay. Then maybe the question needs to change. Maybe what you need isn't to be claimed. Maybe you need someone to just stop and ask what you actually want. A very long silence. No one's done that, she said. I know. She looked at me for what felt like a very long time, but was probably about 6 seconds. Then she turned to the council and said, I acknowledge the claim. What happened in the next approximately 40 minutes is, frankly, a blur. Not because I was unable to track events, but because so many things happened simultaneously, and the council chamber, which was designed for formal, highly structured ceremony, was clearly not equipped to handle a situation in which its entire foundational protocol had just been set aside in favor of something no one had prepared for. Driven called an immediate procedural recess. 3 of the faction vampires on the far side of the chamber began what appeared to be a very heated but extremely controlled argument with one of the council sub-members. Controlled in the sense that no one raised their voice. but the body language was translating to outrage at a volume that didn't require sound. Petra Solon grabbed my arm and pulled me into the observer corridor and stared at me with an expression I can only describe as what is wrong with you, and also, are you okay? I said I thought I was okay. She said, you just claimed a vampire. I said, I know. She said, a specific vampire, the one they couldn't Marcus, the unclaimable one. I know, I said. Does Vranic know? He's about to, I said, because Vranic had entered the corridor from the far end and was walking toward me with the expression of a man who has been monitoring a formal session remotely, has watched something unprecedented happen, and has not yet decided whether he is experiencing a professional crisis or something else. He stopped in front of me. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, I told you not to raise your hand. I know, I said. He was quiet for several seconds. Then, she acknowledged the claim. Yes. In 240 years, he said, no one has ever gotten an acknowledgement out of her. I know. He looked at me for another moment. Then something crossed his face, something very small, very brief, that looked, if I was reading it correctly, like relief. We have a significant amount of paperwork ahead of us, he said. I assumed, I said. He nodded, turned, started walking. Then over his shoulder, well done, Vane. I stood in the corridor with Petra still staring at me and the chamber behind us still in procedural recess. And I thought about Zara Vel Nocturne's face when she'd said I acknowledged the claim and the thing I'd seen on it. Still couldn't name it yet. The formal paperwork took 11 days. I say this not to diminish what happened in the chamber. I'm going to get to what happened afterward, the real aftermath, the things that mattered. But because I think it's important to convey that the moments of genuine human drama are almost always surrounded by enormous quantities of administrative procedure. And the administrative procedure is not glamorous, and it happened, and it was real. 11 days of council hearings, precedent reviews, interspecies legal consultations, and the very careful drafting of a claim document that had no existing template because nothing like it had ever been done before. The Galactic Registry of Interspecies Relations had to be consulted. They sent a representative, a Kelhari named Administrator Pell, who had the air of someone who had expected a quiet posting and was adjusting rapidly to something else, who spent 3 days on the station reviewing codes, precedents, and ancient texts before confirming that the claim was, in fact, legally valid. The codes did not specify species eligibility in the original drafting. The assumption had simply been that all eligible parties would be vampire. No one had written only vampires because it had never occurred to anyone to write it. Zara was placed in transitional housing during the process, a quarter on the residential level that was nicer than her previous allocation, which had apparently been somewhere close to the maintenance corridors, because the station's housing registry, like everything else, didn't quite know how to categorize her. I was not permitted formal contact during the review period. That was a council requirement, standard practice during claim processing, to prevent undue influence on the acknowledgement decision. Which meant I spent 11 days in professional limbo, doing my regular liaison work, attending my regular briefings, eating in the human mess hall, and trying not to think too specifically about what came next. Dina found out about 48 hours after it happened, via station rumor, which spreads faster on Nocturna than light in vacuum, and came to find me in my quarters with an expression that I can only describe as, she had been waiting for this. You raised your hand, she said. Yeah, I said. I told you to say you wouldn't. You did. She sat down on the edge of my bunk, and she acknowledged it. She did. A pause. You asked for her name, Dina said. You told me to. I told you it mattered. I didn't tell you to do it in a way that she'd somehow know. She shook her head slowly. Sorrel told her, he must have told her. He had no reason to tell her. Maybe he had a reason, I said. She thought about that. Yeah, she said finally, maybe. She sat with me for a while after that. We didn't talk much. It was one of those silences that's actually company rather than absence. Before she left, she said, she's been alone for 240 years, Marcus. Don't forget that. I said I wouldn't. She looked at me. I mean it. That's not a metaphor or a detail. 240 years is a long time to be told that you're wrong just for being what you are. Whatever comes next, be careful with that. Okay. Okay, I said. She left. I sat in my quarters with the upward falling light from the corridor strips bleeding under the door and thought about what 240 years felt like on the inside. I didn't have a frame of reference. Humans don't have a frame of reference for that kind of duration. But I tried because I thought trying mattered. On the 12th day, Administrator Pell issued the formal ruling that the claim was legally binding under existing galactic code. On the 12th day, the Council ratified it, not unanimously, but by required majority, with 2 Council members abstaining and Councillor Dreven casting the deciding affirmative vote. On the 12th day, Zara Vel Nocturne's registry status was formally changed. Not to claimed. The exact designation they settled on, after 11 days of drafting, was recognized, interspecies bond, Class 1. They had to create the category. Administrator Pell would later write a 40-page addendum to the Galactic Registry Code, formalizing it as a standing option. And on the 12th day, I was escorted by a Council junior member to a small room adjacent to the claim chamber, not the chamber itself. No one wanted to do this in the chamber again, and I waited. The room had 2 chairs. I sat in one. After a few minutes, the door opened. She sat in the other one. We looked at each other for a moment. She was in different clothes than the claiming session, no formal positioning in her presentation, just dark, practical station gear with a quality of having been chosen rather than assigned. Her hair was still loose. Her eyes were still that deep, nameless dark. "You've been cleared for contact," she said. "As of this morning," I said. "The paperwork took 11 days," she said. "Yes. The last claim attempt's paperwork took 3, she said. They were very confident." "I was not very confident," I said. Something shifted in her expression, not the ghost this time, but something closer to the actual thing. "No," she said. "You weren't, were you?" "Not even slightly," I said. "I had no idea what I was doing." And yet, I agreed. We sat with that for a moment. "You said I said no," she said. 17 times to the wrong question." "Yeah." "What's the right question?" she said. "I don't know yet," I said. "That's why it's a question." A pause, then, "You realize this has never happened before." "I've been briefed on that fairly extensively," I said. "Multiple times, by multiple people, including Commander Vranic." "Who told you not to raise your hand?" she said. "He did. But you did anyway." "I did." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Why?" I thought about it. I didn't try to give a polished answer. I tried to give the actual one. "You were looking at the floor," I said. "When he called for claims, you'd been looking at everything else, the council, the room, me, and then when the actual moment came, you looked at the floor." And I thought, okay, something about that small thing. I paused. "You weren't resigned to it, that's what I read. You weren't sitting there saying, let it be over. You were bracing. There's a difference." She was very still. "You were bracing like someone who expects another wrong answer and is preparing to get through it," I said. "And I couldn't sit there and be another wrong answer." Silence. "So you raised your hand," she said. "So I raised my hand," I said. "To give a different answer." "To try," I said. "I can't promise different, I can only promise try." She looked at me for a long moment. Then, for the first time since I'd seen her, not the ghost of an expression, not the fractional shift, not the careful, controlled composure, she smiled. It was small, it was not performed. It was the kind of smile that comes from something catching you off guard in a way you were not prepared to be caught. It was, I realized, the most completely real thing I had seen on anyone's face in 312 days on Nocturna Station. "You know," she said, "you are profoundly underprepared for this." "I know," I said. "I am a 320-year-old vampire with significant anger management history, and no functional integration with any social structure currently recognized by the Galactic Council." "I know that too," I said. "I break people's bones." "Only when the question is wrong," I said, "so we'll work on asking better questions." She looked at me. "We," she said, testing the word. If you want, I said. That part's up to you, all of it is. That's the point I was trying to make in the chamber. I'm not claiming you like they were. I'm not trying to make you into something. I just raised my hand, that's all. What happens next, you get to decide. The silence was different now. Not the chamber silence, not the procedural silence, not the held-breath silence of 40 vampires watching something unprecedented. Just two people in a small room, with two chairs, and the station humming its baseline truth in the walls around them. Okay, she said finally. Okay, I said. I want tea, she said. Human tea. I've smelled it from the mess hall for 6 months and I've never had it. I blinked, really. Is that an unusual request? No, I said. No, yeah, we can do that. She stood, I stood. She looked at me. For the record, she said, no one has ever asked what I want. I know, I said. That's going to change. She held my gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, just a small nod, but the kind that carries weight. We walked out of the small room together. Into the corridor. Into the upward-falling light. I've been asked, since filing this account, whether I regret it. Vranic asked me. Dina asked me. Administrator Pell asked me in the careful, diplomatic phrasing of someone who needs to know for official purposes. Even Sorrel asked me, one morning in the secondary corridor, stopped me with that same deliberateness he'd had when he told me her name and asked, "Do you regret it?" I always say the same thing. I say, I regret not understanding sooner what unclaimable actually means. It doesn't mean wrong, it doesn't mean broken, it doesn't mean there is something to fix. It means everything offered has been the wrong thing. It means I have been asked to become something I'm not in every possible way that question can be phrased for so long that I have learned to say no before the asking even finishes. Zara Vel Nocturne spent 240 years being told her resistance was the problem. I raised my hand and said, what if the resistance is the answer? She's sitting across from me right now, actually, as I finish writing this. We're in the human mess hall. She comes here most mornings now, sits in the chair with normal ceiling lighting that was built for human-shaped bodies, and drinks what she initially described as bewilderingly fragrant warm water, and what she now acknowledges is actually quite good. She's reading something, one of the cultural archives from the Veldstone inscription catalog, because 2 weeks after the claim session, she asked Sorrel if she could access the full archive, and apparently no one had ever asked before, and he didn't know what to do with that either. She doesn't know I'm watching her while I write this. Or maybe she does. She's 320 years old, and her senses are significantly better than mine, and she is probably very aware of every small motion I make. But she doesn't say anything about it, and neither do I. The dark does not threaten, the inscription in the secondary corridor says. The dark is simply home. I've been thinking about that inscription for 323 days now. I think I finally understand what it means. Not everyone who lives in the dark is something to fear. Some of them have just been waiting for a very long time, in a darkness that other people ran from, for someone who didn't find it threatening.